Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with Tim Padgett to talk more about my conversation with Josh Bales. That's about his new EP, The Weight of Glory. Tim, welcome back.
Oh, good to be back. Talking about Josh, I love that conversation that you guys had past few years at the Colson Center Conference. He does such a great job leading us in worship, and I've hung out with him a few times and read some of his articles. He has some definitely keen insights. Always enjoyed engaging with him.
He's a senior fellow for the Colson Center, but he's also just this old friend. You know, he's this figure who musically, he punctuates every one of our gatherings, going back to, my first days with the ministry, I think. It was amazing, initially seeing him lead the Colson Fellows in worship, lead the Wilberforce Weekend, as it was called for many years, in Sunday morning worship. And then all these years later, he's still participating, he's still doing this. And his music has meant a great deal, both because he sets hymns, he actually does these really great versions of classic hymns, and then because he does a lot of very thoughtful and contemplative and meaningful music himself. And it sounds like this album is the result of, I guess, coming out of a season of not being able to do much recording. He describes it as sort of a personal burnout, and who didn't come close to that point during COVID, especially if you're in the kind of ministry he's in, my goodness, because he's like ministering to people's souls and minds and then, spirits with his music. And that's a great burden to have. But I think what came out of it is just tremendously beautiful and well thought out. And as soon as I heard it, I knew I had to have him back on Upstream to talk about his thinking behind it. Because one thing I've learned about musicians, Tim, is they've always got reams of story behind every seemingly simple song. There's always an account of how they got to that point and what it means to them. And it's almost always worth hearing.
Yeah, I think that's his unique contributions in the world show up in this conversation you guys had. And I think you and I chatted about this the other day, that he's kind of trivocational. He has this clerical role as a priest and pastor. He has this counseling role, helping people through the deepest, darkest struggles. And he has this musician's role, and he does them all well. And it's not merely that he brings insights from being a pastor or a minister, brings insights from being a musician, brings insights from being a counselor, but they can interplay between the three. And I think that how each of them informs the other. And I really do think this showed up in your conversation. He was able to bring some color. It wasn't, and you addressed each of those things. You addressed the theological principles. You went through what we at the Colson Center call our 4 chapters, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. You talked about the technicalities of music. I'm from Nashville, as I've mentioned before, and he's mentioning going up to Nashville. It's like, oh yeah, hometown. And the technicalities of the people he's dealing with, the production of the music, and then also the counseling things. But you see all of those things play together in how he sees those songs being a benefit. Saint Dymphna, I actually hadn't heard of this saint either, despite being a church historian.
Dymphna, right. Apparently etymologically related to Daphne, which is cool.
Yeah. Irish names are just insane. You see, every once in a while, you see people like the Siobhan. It was like Siobhan or something like that. I don't know how. Ethnically, I'm mostly or half Irish anyhow, but I don't know how to do the names. But really, he brought all those things out in your conversation there. And it shows that bringing diversity of skills. I love specialization because it means people can get really good at certain things, but there's also a virtue in being good at more than one thing. And you can bring all of those things to the table. And I think that showed up here.
You know what I love about musicians, and you've probably picked this up living in Nashville, Christian musicians in particular, the ones who I guess have that X factor, that there's an adventurousness and an ability to probe mysteries. And that's what I love. Even the very doctrinaire, well theologically educated, the guys who literally have a ministerial day job, right? Josh is a pastor. He has studied theology. And yet he's able to go into some of the areas where theology, it speaks, but it doesn't give us the full picture, if that makes sense. He helps theology he puts flesh on it in a way. And I do love the way musicians do that. I think artists in general probably have that sense where Jordan Peterson talks about how they're high in trait openness. So they're always opening up to new experiences. And he's like, why is it that in the cities, when you have an arts center, it's always this kind of edgy avant-garde space within the urban sphere. And it has a sense of, okay, this is new and this is a bit out of the ordinary. This is not Normieville. And artists have that drive to open up to new ideas and new experiences. And it's great to see someone who's grounded theologically also experimenting with those adventurous ideas, the edges of the map, if you will. And I think when you're talking about something like, well, this album is significantly about mental health and then connecting that up with creational theology, with what it means to be human and why that's so excellent and beautiful and why there is a weight of glory, as he puts it, to our very existence. We can't get away from it. It's not like Christians have a high calling and nobody else does. We all have a high calling by virtue of who we are, a prince or a princess with royalty pulsing through our veins. I love the way he puts that. And only an artist could really get you to that point. So whether it's with writing or music or painting or something like that, an artist has the ability to say it in a way that captures your attention and then just says, I'd never thought about it like that before. He's doing exactly that. And I do appreciate that, especially in light of the many artists who let their avant-garde streak run away with them, or even let it take them into deconstruction, which is another subject of this album, at least a couple songs on it.
Yeah, I mean, having been around a lot of musicians and artists, and they're definitely, I appreciate that about Josh. He's grounded avant-garde, if that makes sense, in the sense that he's pushing us to ask some questions at times, but you've talked to him, not just on this thing, but he's a very normal guy. And again, in the Nashville world that I came from, there are lots of people who they're artists and they're different and they know they're different and they're going to tell you they're different and they're going to remind you constantly that they're different. And it's really annoying.
Yeah.
But you see where that goes wrong. Certain unnamed artists who have on the edge of the map and gone off the map because I think they get so fascinated with that role of themselves that they push and they push and they push and they lose it. And sometimes that's their fault because of vanity. Sometimes it's the fault of surrounding society that pushes these people who they have a knack for writing poetry. And that's a good thing. They have a knack for writing music in an evocative way. And they get pushed up into a position of preeminence, not to alliterate too much there, but they get pushed there and they end up in a place they don't have the maturity yet to have that role. And they read their press clippings, they get proud and they fall off the edge of that map. And so I think that that's something, in addition to the church having a responsibility to artists to encourage them, they also need to challenge them. I think that it's easy to do one or the other, to say, oh, those artists, they're crazy, get rid of them. Or, oh, they're artists, they're wonderful, let's push them. Well, it's just like anyone else. They have a special gift to give to the church. They have a special gift to give to the world. And they help us to see those things that sometimes the rest of us don't get. But they need discipleship. They need care. They need grounding. And so again, it might be one of those moments where, as much as the ideal artist has no responsibilities other than to create art, there may be a virtue in requiring there to be, not requiring, that's the wrong word, encouraging. Artists have a day job. Parallel, I don't want to pick on artists there, because you think on the great theologians of the past who've contributed so much to the world. The Augustines, the Martin Luthers, the John Wesleys, to go for the rather diverse set there. In addition to being theologians, they were pastors. And I know that very often we tend to think of those as kind of the same sort of thing, but they're very different. Someone who has merely a job of thinking deep thoughts and writing high language things, they can get off the map themselves. They can begin to speculate. And you read some of the stuff, the medieval theologians, and they're going off, in all sorts of ways. They needed that grounding of being pastors. They needed to work. And I don't mean necessarily work in a different sort of role, but to have a connection to ordinary stuff of life. That might be a lesson for all of us. Again, the specialization is good, but the specialization can be problematic.
Well, when you're someone like Josh, you've got the consequences of the questions to deal with. So you could be adventurous as an artist, I guess, and push against things and ask questions and explore areas that theologically Christians would rather not go to. Some of the examples, like mental illness is a great example. Deconstruction is another example. He deals with both of those in this album. But when you're a pastor, you've got to actually deal with those questions in real life. They're not academic or artistic for you, as it were. You actually have to disciple people and counsel people through real questions, real challenges, real problems, real repentance. And I guess if you're a counselor, you're doubly burdened or charged with that sort of care, because you're caring for people in a mental health way as well as a spiritual way. And I love the perspective that Josh brings on that front in particular. So often, we've got this disconnect between the two disciplines. And Upstream listeners will know that I have had guests on several times where we've dealt with this exact question, the intersection or the interplay between mental health and ministry, or spiritual health, let's say. And you can't simply dispense with one and prefer the other. It's very easy for us to think that. And it's especially easy for us to overreact, I think, to the prevailing trending emphasis of our time, which is, and we all know, Gen Z has become characterized as this mental health generation. Everything's mental health. Everybody is gaslighting them. Everybody traumatized them. They're healing from everything you can imagine. And the self-diagnoses are like, not since I spent a lot more time hanging out with homeschool moms have I seen this much self-diagnosis. But instead of like physical stuff and essential oils, it's like mental stuff. There's something that truly needs criticism there. And I think Josh is aware of that fact. But it's easy to fall off in the other direction too, which is there's a name for it, maybe you remember, but there's a type of Christian counseling that just says we got to emphasize the spiritual questions. It's this gospel-centric sort of thing. We should be gospel-centric, but the fact is not all problems are about sin and salvation. Some problems really are about synapses. They really are about serotonin. They really are about the way that sin or brokenness affect our bodies and leave lasting marks and scars. And that's part of the wisdom of the balance that Josh brings to this whole thing. And so I guess as I'm looking at his whole project, and it's easy to overanalyze art or artists, but as I'm looking at his whole project and his whole career, I see this series of very interesting and important balances that he's striking, where he's not running off and we can name names. You weren't going to name names a second ago. We can name names. He's not Derek Webb, right? He's not running off in the direction of deconstructing the whole faith and Christian ethics and everything that Christians have always believed in favor of pushing this avant-garde line. He's got the tenderness. He's got the compassion. He cares for people in the way that it's apparent people like Derek Webb do. But he's also got the structure and the inheritance of orthodoxy to preserve. Well, same way in the mental health front. He's got this recognition of the reality of trauma and mental illness and all the terrible difficulties that patients and those who come to see him and talk with him deal with. But he's also got the realization that you can't make a spiritual problem into a mental problem. You actually do have to deal with people's sin issue and tell them about the weight of glory for which they were created. And all those come together beautifully because human beings are complex, and nobody knows that better than a pastor, musician, counselor. I just think that trifecta is such a great combination and so informative for those who talk with him.
Yeah, I put this in the notes, but I think that your little offhand comment about Phil Collins really encapsulated the whole thing. I doubt you plotted that out. Maybe you did.
No.
But we all have that experience where we have an association with a bad moment and something else, and all of a sudden we group those two. And in your case, was it wisdom teeth or whatever it was, something nasty?
No, it's some fillings and just way too many shots to get to do what they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she had the Phil Collins Spotify playing, and then they're like, the hygienist is like, what's that one song from Tarzan? Yeah. That Phil Collins does.
My heart for what
yeah, right. I had my mouth open, so I like hummed it, and she goes, "There you go. That's the one." Right. Shane's got it.
Yeah, but yeah, it sounds strange. It sounds trite, but it's very real because in a moment like that, you were experiencing pain, and now forever you're kind of tattooed. Your mind is tattooed with that with Phil Collins right. and associations. And again, that sounds silly, but that's real. That's not a made-up thing. Now, obviously, I'm assuming you don't go into conniptions every time you hear Susu Studio come on the radio or something like that.
Yeah, right. Well, it now just sounds like a dentist drill to me. So
yeah, exactly.
And everyone who's ever sat in that waiting room and heard that dentist drill knows the little strain of trauma from past experiences. Oh gosh, whatever. Okay, enough about dentists.
Yeah, but we have that association. You have a certain food when you're sick, and you can't eat that food anymore. We have those things. Those are very real experiences, very common experiences. We recognize the reality of that, but somehow we have trouble recognizing that significant pain, trauma, to use the word that's tossed around too much, a trauma can then give you an association with, say, the church, with, say, a certain doctrine. You see people who, I've known several young women who were abused by their fathers. Their understanding of God as Father is forever going to have been corrupted by that experience. They can't avoid that. That's not a, here's two doctrines, and you take these and you'll call me in the morning. It's not a cognitive issue. It's not that they don't mentally or intellectually understand what it is, but they have been so bent by that experience. We don't expect people who have broken their legs to hop up immediately and start running around. It takes an understanding of what the problem is. It takes a long time of healing and, well, therapy. Now, we don't call it therapy. We don't associate that kind of therapy, but we do talk about physical therapy. We understand how that works there. We understand if someone has had a toxin and their body has been affected by some toxin, they're going to need therapy. But somehow when it comes to mental issues, it's this dichotomy of there's physical and then there's non-physical. And the thing is, mental issues, they bridge that gap. I think we may have mentioned this before. You hear the stories that people who've had severe brain trauma. What's his name? Brady, who was shot when President Reagan was shot. His personality shifted because of the bullet that went through his brain. It's not as though they're merely physical things and then spiritual things. There is an overlap in one sense because we're holistic beings, that our understandings, our comprehensions are affected by, as you said, synapses and hormone levels and chemical levels and things like that. And somehow we have gotten the idea that unless it's a purely physical issue, like a broken arm or a broken toe, we somehow think that it can be handled in a classroom. The classroom stuff matters. It absolutely matters. The book stuff matters. But sometimes what people need is they need someone to walk along with them. And while, as I said in my notes, I don't think that the use of the term deconstruction is helpful. There's a postmodern philosophy background that it brings in too much, and it's used in, I think, a way that is, I don't mean by Josh, but lots of people, I think it's used in a very unhelpful way. So I don't like to use the term myself in a positive sense. But when people have been brought up, I mean, the talk right now on Twitter, it's about this, the documentary about the Bill Gothard thing.
Shiny, happy people.
Yeah, shiny, happy people. I haven't read that World Magazine article about it yet. I think you shared it on social media. And so there's lots of criticism we might level towards it. That being said, people who've been brought up in an unhealthy environment, an ungodly environment, not even talking about necessarily abusive situations. Again, I haven't seen it, so I can't speak into that. But people who've been brought up in an unhealthy social environment are going to have been affected by that. As a result, they get older and they realize that, hey, I don't see, this isn't healthy. And they're going to associate, just like you associate Phil Collins with dental drills. They, on this much deeper level, are going to forever associate Christianity, the church, the fatherhood of God, with these unhealthy or even abusive situations they've been in. Those people need doctrine. They also need a friend. They also need what Josh was talking about. They need someone to come alongside them. And I think that when we get into conversations about deconstruction, we fail to make proper distinctions. You had mentioned the breakpoint. We have talked about deconstruction, and I've written some of those pieces criticizing the use of the word deconstruction. And I stand by those because what I'm talking about there is how people have come along and said, yes, deconstruct, follow your path. And I think it's a very unhealthy thing to do. I don't think it's actually helping the people. What I've been saying to those things and what we have been saying to the Colson Center is that this is not helping the people it's claiming to help. What we're critiquing is the people who've come alongside, not the fact that they've come alongside. We've critiqued the way that certain people have come alongside. But those people who are hurting, those people who are brought up in abusive environments, they need more than just doctrine. They need something other than what the pro-deconstructors are saying, because the pro-deconstructors are basically saying, just go away from the path that you've been on. But they're not being given guidance back to the truth, back to the goodness. So we need both of those things tied together. We need correct doctrine, but we need people like Josh who can come alongside, who have that knack for walking with someone in their tears. That's one of the reasons that I love, we were talking earlier about that. I've got Francis Schaeffer books behind me. That's one reason I love Francis Schaeffer, is because he could write all these books about philosophy and avant-garde cinema and epistemology and theology and the importance of doctrine. He was very staunch on these things, but he also wept with people. And finding people who can do that, that is amazing. People like Josh who can walk alongside, this doctrine is true, and I'm walking with you in your pain. And I'm not going to push you right now to get to that point where you're not capable of grasping that, pushing them along on that journey. I was reading a book recently where it emphasized the fact that the original name for Christianity was the Way. I don't mean that we broke something and changed something, but it was an early name that it was the Way. And you see this thing in the...
This is the way.
Yeah, this is the way. And I loved your little comment about our shared PCA background and the Mandalorian that's at the PCA General Assembly right now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for those who have no idea what we're talking about, Presbyterian Church in America a few years ago changed their logo. It's a Bible with like a sun coming up behind it and a cross in the middle. And it just happens to look exactly like the helmets of the Mandalorians from Star Wars. And if you don't know what that is, then I will not ask you to find out what that is, but it's a running joke that it looks just like the Mandalorian.
Yeah, the poor graphics guys who came up with that. It wasn't, the Mandalorian show had not come out yet. And so They have a little bit of excuse, but still, they saw Star Wars. They had to have known that.
They saw Boba Fett. They knew.
Yeah, exactly. But with the way, and you see in the Bible, this emphasis in the New Testament of the way, and you see this emphasis in the Old Testament of the path, walking with God. There is this trajectory element. I don't mean that truth changes, but truth changes us. And that doesn't happen in a moment. That takes time for us to grow in our sanctification, to grow in our understanding of God. And I think that having that patience, holding those two things in tension, of that there's objective truth, propositional truth that people need to be impacted by, but also there's that personal element. It takes some time. God works on us, shapes us like a potter in clay, takes us from where we are to a place. And it's not an instantaneous thing. There is an instantaneous element of Christianity, but there's also this progressive pushing towards the objective truth.
And you have to push towards it. You can't give up and run toward what you perceive are easy answers or an easy escape. And that's the twin set of mistakes that those who begin deconstructing can make. You can run to a sort of rigid, I don't want to use the word fundamentalism because I agree with, I think it was Alvin Plantinga who joked that it's, this useless word that just means stupid people who are more conservative than I am. It's kind of just what it means. It's useless. But what I'm getting at is the rigid reactionary attitude that you can run toward and say, okay, we're going to be an institute for basic life principles. We're going to be a Bill Gothard. We're going to control every aspect of our lives in this way that, in our families' lives, in a way that guarantees success. So we take the uncertainty out of the equation. We take the humanity out of the experience of Christianity and life in general. But then there's the other direction where you say, okay, the whole thing is rotten to the core. I'm just going to run from my bad experiences, from my trauma, from my upbringing, from the things that just didn't sit right with me or weren't done well. And I'm going to run into the easy answers that the culture is offering, that my secular artists promise me, the ones who have deconstructed, or my secular friends seem to be living, and obtain that kind of happiness. Run for that. It's like, I'm so happy. That's what you always hear from people who deconstruct. It's this running theme of, I'm so happy, I'm so at peace, while they like bawl their eyes out. And you get the sense that, okay, you think you've found something here, but have you really? I mean, do you look at someone like a Derek Webb, and we're getting real here, but if you watch that music video for it's a song called Boys Will Be Girls, right? And it means exactly what you think it means. And he sits there and gets turned into a drag queen in the music video. And you ask yourself, has he found the answer there? Has he found true life and thriving and wholeness and humanity? And can he look at himself and say, this is the weight of glory. This is what it means to be made in God's image, to reject, at least symbolically, I don't know where he is personally, but to symbolically reject and affirm the rejection of created maleness or created femaleness, and then twist it in this way that our culture says you can twist it now and be truly yourself. Is that the path to real happiness? And, God really orchestrates providentially what you read and what you hear and what you see. The older I get, the more I realize that. And right now, I'm rereading Augustine's Confessions. which is incredible in so many ways. It's impossible to exhaust. But one of the things that you quickly find out is that Augustine is such a stable thinker precisely because he has run in that direction. He ran to the culture of his time and thought it had the answers. And he was reacting in many ways against what he perceived in Christianity, rebelling against his mother, Monica. She comes to him and is like, Augustine, please, I see you're becoming a teenager. Your dad isn't helping with this. Please don't fornicate. Please don't sleep with a married woman, or all the things that she pled with him. And he said, and this seemed like womanish counsel to me and worse than foolish. It was like he just spurns all wisdom and runs headlong into his debaucheries and what he thinks is going to fulfill him. And the power of Augustine's autobiography is that he, like so many modern deconstructors, he sounds so modern. He is looking for that joy, for that rest, for that glory, the thing that he's looking for, something to satisfy his heart. And he gets to the point eventually where he realizes and confesses to God, there is nothing that will satisfy me. You are my satisfaction. You are the thing that I was looking for and that I needed. And I think going back even to some of Josh's older songs, there's one, I'm trying to remember the title of it. It's about how everything that we search for, even sin, we're ultimately looking for something God made us to seek. He opens the song with talking about how a guy shows up at a brothel door and in some way he's looking for God. And that sounds, it sounds cringy.
It sounds awful.
Like that sounds too far. It's like, Josh, back off a little bit. But then I remembered, this is what Augustine actually says, that when we're looking, all the sins we run to, we're actually looking for something we were designed to seek. We're looking for a good. And even in the worst sin, there is some element of the thing that you're looking for there is a created good. And you're twisting and perverting the way that you were meant to seek it. Or what does Lewis say? Your evil consists in going after something good at the wrong time or with the wrong person or in the wrong way or to the wrong degree or something like that. And it's exactly true. But Augustine is such a powerful rejoinder to the modern deconstruction attitude, precisely because he ran to the culture and was like, fulfill me. And it couldn't fulfill him. And I think many of the folks who, whether we're talking about a Paul Maxwell or a Derek Webb or a Joshua Harris or any of the other, we could just go on naming names, artists and authors and musicians who were once professing Christians and now have run to something else and think they found it. It would be great to sit down with them at some point and just say, how's that going for you? Have you found the paradise that you were hoping for in secular loves, in the things that they profess as the truth? Or is your heart still restless? And Augustine is a testimony, a lasting perennial testimony that it doesn't work. So I love the stability of Josh's thought on that. It's kind of what I'm trying to say. He knows where that journey ends, where it leads. He's seen it go there. And it gives him the steadiness to just say, no, guys, I don't have all the answers. And his song Shadowlands is directly addressed to deconstructors or would-be deconstructors. He's like, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that if you pursue God in good faith and you refuse to give up and you accept this tension of living in the Shadowlands, then you're going to end up in a much better place than if you just sort of ran for easy answers, either in the quote-unquote fundamentalist side or on the deconstructor post-Christian side.
Jumping off the Shadowlands there's what we were talking about there, but it reminded me in the movie Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. There's this great line where they're chatting with the first meeting.
That's a sort of biographical of C.S. Lewis's marriage and subsequent bereavement with Joy Gresham. For those who don't know, it's it's kind of a classic C.S. Lewis movie. But yeah, Anthony Hopkins as Lewis, my goodness.
I know. He could do Hannibal Lecter. He can do C.S. Lewis. He's wonderful. But there's this great moment in the when Joy Davidman is meeting Lewis at the time, and he says that he didn't used to be a believer, and she says, "You mean we're both lapsed atheists?" And I loved that line because one, it's kind of funny, but also it reminds me of something that some of the greatest champions of the Christian faith, Augustine, C.S. Lewis, Schaeffer, as I mentioned before, Justin Martyr. These are people who did not grow up as Christians. Now, Augustine grew up in a Christian home, to some degree, at least his mother was, and lots of things like that. But they're people who spent a long period of time as non-Christians. Schaeffer became a Christian when he was like 19 or 20. Augustine, it's I think like 30 or so. Justin Martyr, I've forgotten. He was a relatively young man, but he had a career before this time. And you have some of the greatest apologists for classic little o Orthodox Christianity had spent an extended period of their lives as non-Christians, yet they found it. So I guess my response to the deconstruction debate is we need to work on reconstructors. Absolutely, there's the people coming out of the Bill Gothard type things, or a host of other things. There's that sort of thing. There's the rigorous, rigid rules. Again, alliterating too much here. But you also have the easy believism, the pop culture Americana evangelicalism, where follow these rules and everything will be okay with you. And it's not the rigid rules of, of the umbrella kind of nonsense theology that the Gothardites were into, but it's if you do this, you obey the rules, work hard, everything will go well for you. And this is one of those things you want to introduce them to the book of Job or Ecclesiastes and the wisdom literature. But what we see in those things, people see that and they realize life doesn't work out that way. And instead of rejecting the false theology, they reject all of the theology. And so it's a deconstruct, but what they need to do is they need to reconstruct. And one of the pieces that John Stonestreet and I did about deconstructionism is we talked about the fact that all the words that you have in Christian theology in the Bible, redemption, restoration, that's a thing, reconciliation.
This is an old theme for John, going back many years.
Yeah, all of these things, they're focused on going to something, not merely away from what's bad, but towards what is good. The world is on a reconstruction project. And I think that that's what we need to emphasize, because we need to work on reconstructing people's souls. We need to reconstruct these harmed minds, these harmed bodies, these harmed personalities who very often have been harmed by the church. And instead of simply saying, get away from the church, it's let's restore what's right. And that's one of the things at the Colson Center we talk about. Find what's wrong in the world and fight it. Find what's good and let's encourage it. And I love that fact that you guys talked about the importance of dealing with creation. It's easy to talk about the fall, as you guys said, because if you've fallen, if you see your own sin, there's no accountability. You're not expected to do better if you see yourself solely as a mess. And I mentioned in the notes that I had a professor. It was just for a 1-week class. It was an African-American professor. He talked about the fact that he would never have become a Christian without Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X, to my knowledge, never became a Christian to the end of his days. But Malcolm X told young black men, you matter. You have value. You have dignity. And this professor noted that he had to recognize that he had dignity before he could see then that he had fallen from that dignity. He had not lived up to that dignity. He had not lived up to the standards that he was called to. And so I think that's a great example of why creation matters. We have to see that there's something to which we are called before we can recognize the significance of how we've fallen from it. And seeing that beauty, seeing someone who's struggling with some kind of sin, they need to see there's a higher thing to which they're called, not to pound them into guilt, but to say, this is the way, again, to go back to our Mandalorian theme there, that there is a better way to do things.
It's that great Augustinian picture that we were made for something. We have pursued the wrong thing, and we will continue to be restless, dissatisfied, broken until we return to our true love, the one who made us for himself. It's such a perfect biblical summary. And it's what comes out in, well, it's why people love Herman Bavinck. It's why this theology of a 4-chapter gospel instead of a 2-chapter presentation has really resonated and has built up so many people's faith and renewed a Christian imagination for what the world is and what it could be and what God calls us to make it. Because it really is easy to look around and look inward and say, isn't everything messed up? Isn't this place an absolute wreck? Whether you're talking about the world or your soul. But it's much more difficult, I think, to look at those things and say, this is a ruined masterpiece. This is marvelous. This was meant for an eternal weight of glory. Whether you're talking, eschatologically, like Paul seems to be in 2 Corinthians 4, or you're talking about creation, like Lewis seems to be doing in the Weight of Glory sermon. He talks about both, really, but in that moment, he's emphasizing what we were created for, what we are by nature, and then what that intent is. And the beauty is that God, and this is that Augustinian note, God doesn't give us something that's alien to who we are. In salvation, God gives us the fulfillment of what we were created to be. He's just giving us the food we were made to eat, the water we were made to drink, the life we were made to subsist on is himself. And there is nothing else that he can give us other than himself, because we're made for him. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. And it is the answer to the deconstruction attitude. It's the answer to this overreaction against Christianity in favor of, against abusive or distorted forms of Christianity in favor of some new trendy cultural gospel that can never fulfill you. It's the reason why you contrast the reactions of some of the deconstructors coming out of IBLP circles with the deconstructors who've also, come out of those same circles, but have gone in a very different direction. This is why I was, again, going back to that Providence thing. I was so struck by the fact that I invited Ginger Duggar Vuolo on to Upstream a couple weeks ago to talk about her story of re-examining, not deconstructing, but as she says, disentangling her Christianity from the rules with which she was brought up in that family, right? Under that ministry and that set of beliefs and practices, and her ability to actually find a fuller and truer expression of the Christian faith she's always believed, rather than reject the whole thing. I mean, she pressed into it instead of running away from it. And that's the move right there. That's the whole thing. And it was just so providential that I had her on before I even knew about this documentary that was coming out, because it offers a wonderful little rejoinder. It's like, hey guys, it doesn't have to go this way. In fact, one of the Duggars is, I'm sure, there's a lot of them, right? So I'm sure there are many, that's the whole point. I'm sure there are many stories, and I don't know them all, nor do I claim to summarize them all in the least bit. I've just had one conversation, but it does present a very clear contrast, I think, and helps us understand exactly what we're talking about here. And that is exactly what Augustine said, that God made us for himself. And what that means is that we are wonderful creatures. We are marvelous creations. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. It should bring us to our knees in awe and gratitude to understand what God has done for us, that royalty pulsing through our veins. We are princes and princesses, future kings and queens. I did a talk, it was a challenge for my daughter's 4th grade class at her classical Christian school. They asked me to, do this talk for the kids when they graduated last month. And so I themed it around Narnia, and how when the children enter Narnia, the thing that is so strange is not the talking animals, it's not the everlasting winter, it's not even the interdimensional travel through a coat closet. It is the fact that when they enter, everything and everyone there immediately recognizes them as kings and queens. They immediately are recognized as royalty before they even know it. There's creatures just saying, hey, here they are. They're here to fulfill the prophecy and restore order to Narnia, because it's never right here unless a son of Adam or daughter of Eve is on the throne, or all 4 thrones, as is the case. And that's exactly the situation we find ourselves in our world. Of course, when you are, to draw another Lewisian theme, when you are created for such a high calling, your corruption is all the more profound and all the more desperate and destructive. And the great part about Augustine is there's nobody who recognizes our high calling better, and there's also nobody who recognizes the totality of our depravity and concupiscence better than Augustine. He sees that great gulf, that great contrast, and he just emphasizes it and says that's how great our salvation is. That's where the gratitude comes from. So yeah, I'm so grateful for the themes that Josh is playing with in this album, because it helped me think through them, and it helped them sink into my thinking and my prayer life and my soul as I listened and prepared for the episode in a way that was just, again, providential. So thank you for coming on to discuss this with me, Tim. I want to also direct our listeners to Josh's. So he has a website, that's joshbales.com. And you can actually listen to samples of all the songs there, and I guess download the project as well. And then check out his other past music, because he's done the thing where he writes his own songs, but then he's also performed versions of hymns. And I love that. I think it's so well done. And there's a simplicity to his music and his style and his vocals that are Well, it just
Very
makes
clear and clean.
Yeah, clear and clean. And it makes me think of Colson conferences every time. I'm just transported back to, Wilberforce weekend circa 2013. So check it out, guys. Josh Bales, EP is Weight of Glory, and I enjoyed it a great deal. Thanks, Tim, for joining me here to talk about this.
Absolutely. And one more thing, if I can add, if you do go to the Colson Center website and you look up his name, there are a series of articles he did for us when we were doing columns where he takes some of his songs and then kind of unpacks them. So there's both the music attached as a file, and then he kind of explains a little bit of where behind it. So not just this album, but some of the previous ones, he unpacks it there.
Yeah, we'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Thanks again, Tim.
Absolutely.
Upstream listeners, we're excited to announce Colson Center National Conference online for just $49. You can learn from Justin Bailey, Stephen Meyer, Briston Wagoner, and many more speakers from our annual Christian Worldview Conference. And if you use promo code Upstream, you can receive $5 off. That's promo code Upstream. For more information about this on-demand experience, visit colsonconference.org.